Okay, so let me just put this one up. Okay, so yesterday was arrays part one. Today's gonna be arrays part two, and so the lecture won't be that long because it'll be building off a lot of what we went over already, or what we went over already yesterday, but just extending it a little bit further out. So one of the things that me and Sumilita have both mentioned, right, is this idea that like, hey, we use these different data types because for each data type, JavaScript gives us some pretty nifty tools to do things with it. We've already seen one of them, right? Index of, which allows you to search, a string for a particular letter or a series of letters, or with an array, index of searches through the elements for us. Now, in our workshop yesterday, what we did was we actually built index of from scratch. And the idea is like, yeah, we can still do it by ourselves, right? We can still build it from the ground up if we wanted to. But the guys or the folks who wrote JavaScript were like, hey, we know you're gonna be doing this a lot, so let's just build it in for you and make it really easy for you to do. So that every time we want to use an array, you don't have to build everything from the ground up again. So index of was an example, and today we're just going to talk about a lot more examples of methods on arrays that really makes it easy for us to use them. Okay, so one of the things to know is that arrays that this functionality is built in, and what that means is if you use an array in JavaScript, you are going to have access to these functions. You don't need to import anything new. You don't need to do anything special. Like if something supports or runs JavaScript, then by default it's going to support all these functionalities. And there's a lot of array methods, and there's more being added, all the time. But let's just take, even for something like ES6 or ES7 or ES5, right? In every variation of JavaScript they updated, one of the things that they always do is they say, okay, great. Are there any other new functionalities that we want to be able to build into this version of JavaScript so that future people can use it and use it very conveniently? So here is a list of some of the typical array methods. By all means, do not memorize this list because it won't really help you. And when I say that, what I mean is more like there's a lot to memorize, and then within each of these functions, takes in different arguments. There's mandatory arguments. There's optional arguments. There's a lot of nuance between all of these. And so rather than spending all your time and once again just kind of memorizing these list by list, get a quick sense of, okay, if I need to do something that's very commonly done, I should come to this list first and just try to and just think about, is there anything is this a very commonly done procedure? And if it is, chances are more likely than not that someone's already figured out a way to do it. So just going through some of these really quickly, right? Pop, we removed the last element of an array, right? You don't need to memorize, pop or all the arguments or what it does specifically, but you just need to know that, okay, if I've ever needed to remove something from the end of an array, there's a function that exists, and if you ever need to use it, you can just Google it, and the first link that you come will be documentation around how to use pop. Push adds something to the end of the array, so in some ways it's the opposite of pop. Dot length, I think we've all used a lot. That just tells you how many elements are in the list. Dot shift, it removes and returns the first element. Unshift does the exact opposite of that. Index of searches, and then slice and splice. Slice and splice both help you get a subsegment of the array, but their use cases are very different, and we'll actually cover them in a little bit more depth. This is just a sample of the of the methods that arrays have. And once again, don't spend all your time memorizing this list or memorizing all the parameters. Just know that they exist, and we need to use them. Feel free to look in the documentation to just be very, very clear on how you're using it, what the arguments are, etc. Over time, as you use these more and more, you'll build up a very kind of familiar relationship with them, and you might even be able to use a lot of them, off the top of your head, right? And that's great. I know, for example, whenever I use .slice or .splice, I know they exist. I kind of have a sense of what they do, but if I'm ever using it, I always go to docs for it just in case, just to kind of read up on, say, okay, the first argument is this, second argument is this, and then if I need a third argument, it's this, right? Like it's something that, you should memorize this through doing it a lot and building a familiarity with it, as opposed to just memorizing the pure text. And yeah, and for array methods, the same link where we get all the other documentations, the site that's supported by the Mozilla Foundation, it's where all of this is too, and they cover it in really great detail. So for every one of these methods that we use for the array, the two most critical questions are: one is, does this modify the original array? And two is, what does this method return? The first question is very valuable. It's something that you need to know, because not knowing it is incredibly dangerous. And the reason why is, if I create an array, right, and I call a function on it, and then I use this array somewhere else, if I don't know in the intermediary step if that variable is being changed, if that array is being changed, if I'm using it down the road and it has been changed, well then my function is probably going to break, because I'm going to be doing something to what I think is an array, but in reality it might be something else entirely different, right? It's almost like the way that we edit a global variable. It's like, like you don't actually, if you don't know who's touching it or who's doing what to it, you really can't feel safe about using it down the road, right? So the first one is super important, because you really want to be aware that whenever I call an array, how am I changing the existing array, and how does that affect subsequent or future uses of that array? So something like pop, right? If you noticed earlier, when I wanted to remove an element from an array, I just did array.pop, right? No reassignment, no creating a brand new array and then pushing things to it. Right? I just called .pop, and what that did was that actually removed the element off of the original array. So if I ever do anything with that array down the road, that array is now going to be short one element. Cool. Something else like index of or .length, right? In those cases, we call it, but it doesn't really change the original array, right? I can call array.index of as many times as I want, array.length as many times as I want. Later on, if I wanted to do something with that array, it's the same exact array still. There have been no changes to it. So that's what we mean when we say, just be careful that you're aware if this is modifying the original array, or if it's kind of harmless in the sense that it doesn't mutate anything. And the second thing is, what does this method return? This one I think trips up a lot of people, and I'm almost sure in tonight's workshop it'll trip you up in some cases too. The idea is that every function returns something, right? Like even if you don't say return, what does it return by default?
Undefined.
Undefined, right? So just keep it in the back of your mind. Every function is always returning something. The question now is, what does it return, right? So when I do a dot length on an array, what data type is it giving me? Gosh, a number, right? It's a length, right? It's x elements long, or x things long, right? If I do dot index of, what data type is it giving me? Also a number, right? Because it's also telling me how, or it's telling me where it's located, and it's gonna give me a -1 if it doesn't find what I need to find. So in that case, the array is giving it, right? On the other hand, if I do something like dot pop, right? This one you'll play around with a little bit tonight, but that actually gives back the element that I just removed. So if I want to delete something from an array, if I call array.pop, it removes the last element, but it also gives it back to me, right? And so the idea there is like, well, if I store that value, then now I've kind of kept a copy of what was just removed. If I don't want to keep a copy of it, I can just call .pop, and it will change the original array, right? So in that case, it's also super important for us to know when we do call a function. Well, like every time we always call a function, we always worry about what are we getting back from it. This is just an extension of that principle, right? Because when we call these methods, like we are getting something back. It's just a matter, are we aware of what it is, and do we want to keep using it? So
when you say get it back, like, but it doesn't always show up, perhaps in the console if you don't call it though. Like when I use push or pop, I mean I could be wrong, but I don't remember it just automatically typing out another line. Is that what you're talking about, or is it just have something in like a cache or metaphorical?
Sure. Well, so the console, once again, is meant for human consumption. So unless you're console logging out something, nothing really logs to the console, right? Like, and that's just for us to see things. It doesn't indicate how the computer program is actually running it in a lot of ways. What I'm talking about here is
It's kind of returning silently.
Yeah, so let's just call something like a function. I'll use my name as a function. Oop. And then here I'll have something like var array equals 1, comma 2, comma 3. Okay, and down here I'll call David. This is going to give me back return undefined, right? Because the David function is still returning something. I didn't tell what it was, so it's going to return undefined by default. On the other hand, if I return back 6 here, it's going to return 6. Everyone goes so far? Now, if I want to do something like like array.pop, or rather, let me do this here. If I do array.pop, and then I return the array, .pop removes the last element. .pop removes the last element from my array, right? So in line 4, I am transforming the original array. So on line 6, when I return the array, it's going to return an array with only 2 elements in it, right? And that's exactly what I see here, right? However, if I instead move this here, and I return it now it's going to give me 3, because 3 was the thing that I just removed, right? And so when I say like what do we get back is, in this case we captured what the function what the .pop function gave back to us, and we returned it, right? The other way to do this, if I say like var x equals array.pop, and now I return x, it's the same result, right? On the other hand, once again, if I just keep calling array.pop and returning the array, then it will still work, but now the results are very different, right? So in this case, I am this is returning something to me, but I'm just kind of throwing it away and saying I don't need it. I just care about what you do to the original array. But this function will always return something. It's a matter of whether or not we store it or how we use it. Cool. And then mutative arrays are, as the name indicates, mutative functions, as the name indicates, are functions that change the underlying array. So things like push, right? It adds an element to the end of the array. Well, that changes the underlying array, but but just be careful about what it returns, right? In this case, first.push, it definitely increments the list by a nicer element, but what it's going to return to you is the new length of the array, right? In most cases, we don't really care about how long the new thing is. We just need to know that we added this thing to the end of the array, and that's really cool, right? But just like .pop, all of these functions will return something. Just make sure that you know what it is, and make sure that that if you want to use it, like you're using it appropriately. Just be aware of what these functions are returning, and if you choose to ignore it, like make sure you know what you're ignoring. So index of, right? This is a classic one. I mean, we built this from scratch last class actually, and it just basically goes through and finds the element that we want. It gives us the index of the element that we want. If it doesn't find it, then what it does is it just returns a -1, indicating that hey, we couldn't find it. Now, one limitation of index of is that if you remember how we built the for loop last time, right? When we built the solution ourselves, we started at index 0 and worked our way to the right of the array, right? And we stopped as soon as we found a hit, which also tells us that hey, this means that we're only going to give you the first result, the first match that we find, right? So if there are 3 things in this array that match that result, well, you're not going to know about the other 2 because we're going to stop as soon as we hit the first one. And this is obviously this is a very intentional design for index of, but this is also an example of hey, if you're going to use index of, in the back of your mind, just be aware that this is only going to return to you the first instance of whatever it is you want to find, right? This is what I mean when I say like these methods are super helpful, but you need to know what you're doing with them. Like you need to know their limitations and how to use them before we just kind of distribute them more freely. Index of also has an optional argument, right? Right now, what we've done so far is we've always just said index of, give you the thing that you want to search for, and that's pretty much it. But index of also has a second optional argument, and in fact, a lot of these functions have optional arguments, right? And in this case, what index of says is, hey, if you give me a number in my second argument, then that tells me I'll start my search from there on off, right? So if you know, for example, that you have a list of 30 things, there's probably more than one match, but you only care about the matches after the 20th element. then you just gotta tell them, hey, start searching from element 20 onwards. And so these are just all like kind of examples of maybe more edge use cases, but definitely features that the JavaScript does support with all these functions. Dot slice is another one. Dot slice is what you want to do is what you use if you want to take or copy a part of an array, or rather copy a part or an entire array. One of the things about slice that most people who use it really like it doesn't change the original array. So in that way, it's very safe, right? Now we can still obviously change the array by doing a array equals array.slice, right? Reassigning will still always change the original thing. That's always a given. But if you notice how it was .pop, we didn't need to do any reassignment to change the original element. Here for slice, it doesn't do that. It definitely does allow us to it definitely preserves the state of the original array. Now, because it preserves the state of the original array, if we're going to try to create a copy of something, then it means we need to capture the value that copy somewhere else, right? So that's why on this line here it says, don't do this. That thing that I just highlighted, focus.slice 0,2, that's useless, right? Because guess what so the two things that's doing. The first thing it's not doing is it's not changing folks, right? Because we're creating a copy of it. And the second thing it's not doing is that it's not really capturing that value anywhere. So when we say don't do this, the good news is it's not very dangerous. Nothing bad's going to happen. But the bad news is nothing good's going to happen either, right? Because we don't change the original array. We create a copy. We don't store it anywhere. And so really, it's like nothing really happened. So another reason why when you use these methods, just be very careful. And for tonight's workshop, I'll ask you to walk me through step by step what you're doing to make sure that that you do very transparently understand how these functions are working underneath the hood. Splice is the the more dangerous sibling of slice. It actually removes or adds elements to the original array, and what it does is it does actually change the original array. So once again, as with anything that changes the original element that you're calling it on, be very, very careful about what it does. In the example, you can definitely take a look at it and read the documentation. It just lets you know hey, where do I start and how many things do I take off? And then if you also want, optionally, how many things to add, right? But once again, it will change the original array, and it will give you back the things that it took out. Okay, so me talking at you is not going to help you really kind of know how to use this. Once you start using it a few times, you'll really quickly get a sense of oh wow, these functions are really dangerous. The ones that do change the original array.
It adds directly where there was deletion.
Yep. And then lastly, and this should be a theme for this class in general, right? We can only kind of go through so much in a week. Documentation is by far your best friend. And if you're stuck on a problem and I come over and try to help you and you're not looking at the docs for that function, you don't understand why it's not working, I'm just going to say look at the docs and have you probably look at the docs for a few minutes before we kind of revisit the problem, right? Documentation is something that every developer uses, and the better one and the good ones, in my experience, use it more often than the other ones. And it's just because you can only know so much, right? But the documentation is always up to date and it's very clear about what it's doing. And really, there's no reason not to use it, especially when you're first starting off and just trying to get a hang for how these array methods work. Okay, cool. So, any questions so far on array methods? Good. Cool. The second part of this class then is probably more of a review than anything else. And this one I'll go through even faster, which is just so now that we've done a few workshops, we're clearly out of the reviewing JavaScript jumpstart kind of zone of stuff, right? We've also noticed that, as the workshops get harder and harder, there is an element of, hey, we have to be, more efficient with our time, right? We can't just troubleshoot everything by going through it, in a very manual manner. So here we're just going to show you a few quick tips on debugging stuff. There's things that you probably already use, to be quite honest. But at the same time, there's things we just want to make sure that like we explicitly cover because these are by far the most common ways to kind of resolve simple bugs. And this chart, just the chart on the right, is entirely accurate. Like you spend way more time fixing bugs, reading about other people's code than you do writing your own stuff. In some ways, writing your own stuff is the easier part because you're a master of your own domain, right? You know what you want to do, you know how you want to do it. What you can't control is what other people do or what the computer does. So in a lot of ways, like debug, like if you like don't get frustrated that you're spending possibly a majority of your time fixing bugs because that is just what programming is, right? It's debugging and testing and making sure this actually does what you want it to do. So the first one, and this is the one that I'm a pretty big fan of, and you've seen me use it quite a bit, right? Is just like drop console logs everywhere. I think a lot of times when we're starting off, like we make a lot of assumptions when we write code. Like, oh, like we do this on line 1. Well, by line 2 it should be this, and then by line 3 I should take that and what I produce on line 2 and put it into line 4, and then we go through this, right? And by the end of it, we put the inputs through this meat grinder of a code, and we're like, well, the answer should be this. And we run the function and it's not. And we're like, well, like clearly somewhere along the line, like something unexpected happened, right? So at that point, the question is just like, at what point did things deviate from what we were expecting? And so I'm always a big fan of console logging as much as you can. Usually, it's good to it depends on how you want to approach it. You could drop a console log, line by line from the very beginning. You could drop it at the point where you think things are going to get hairy. But really, all it does is it's a way for you to verify that my code is correct up to this point. It's pretty much what it is. And secondly, it also just says, hey, this next step is happening the way that I expect it to. Also, this thing. Add a string before you log out any variables. If you want to know what this variable is, log a string first that just tells you, hey, this variable is this, right? The worst thing in the world is to have something like this here, where you're logging out 4 things in a row. On your console, you have a bunch of numbers. And you're like, oh, I actually don't know what any of those numbers stand for, right? I've seen people do it, and it's really time-consuming because then you're going back into your code trying to line them up. And especially when you have like a for loop or a bunch of loops in there, like the things are going to show up in not sequential order, and then you're just wasting a lot of your time trying to figure out what maps to what, when this is infinitely faster and a lot more efficient and just a lot more clear for anyone who's looking at your code to figure out what's going on. So whenever you log out a variable or anything else for that matter, add a small label to it. It's cheap and it's fast, and it doesn't really do any harm. This one we've also seen, which is just that console logs for the most part are very, very useful, but don't think that's like a panacea or a crutch in terms of like, oh yeah, like whatever I see in my console log must be exactly what my problem is or my code is, right? Because once again, console logs are meant for human consumption. There's a difference between the way a computer sees something versus the way that a human sees something, right? And so if you try to log out, for example, this nested array here, that is what it is, like when we see on the computer screen. But JavaScript, we'll look at it and say, well, it's a pretty deeply nested array, so it'll just be an object, right? And so it does a lot of these simplifications for you. And in these cases, like it's up to you to know that like these are the limitations of the console log. And so when you're console logging things, also make sure that you're pretty clear on what you're looking for, right? Don't just console log things arbitrarily, because at the end of the day, like you want to anytime you write code or do anything, like it should be a very direct purpose as to what you're doing. So you also want to use any testing you do or any debugging you do to make sure that you're on track, that your code is still very focused on the end goal. And then don't perform operations in your console log statements. Console log should really only just be to look at things. And then lastly, and I know we talked about this before, returns versus console logs, right? Console logs, once again, only lets you look at code, okay? It's not a substitute for a return. A computer, for the most part, ignores the console log statements. The only thing that really matters for a computer is what the return is at the end of the day. And so console logging something is not the same as returning something. Now, in REPL, I know there's a bit of a confusion / like REPL sometimes only returns the last thing that's run, and it may be less than ideal. If that's the case, then on the very last line, like when you actually run your code, you can put all of that in a console log, and that will probably help you run multiple things at once. But definitely when you're writing your own function, like make sure that that last return statement is accurate, and that's what you want, right? We can always console log out to the screen later, right? We can always add more console logs, but really like the return is the bread and butter of your function, so that's pretty much a non-negotiable. Yep. So adding console logs at different places. This one is something that everyone should do, which is if you're iterating through a loop and at some point in the loop something's broken, make sure to log out multiple things, right? Log out what the index is, and also what the element is. So that way, when you look at it, it's very clear like where your code is going to be breaking, right? And doing it in a for loop, make sure that you'll capture every single loop as it runs through. Bless you. So like these are all things that once again I think you've all been doing, but it's just something we want to just make sure that you're really kind of clear on in terms of best practices regarding console logs. And then lastly is this one, interpreting error messages. JavaScript error messages are kind of a blessing and a curse, right? One, like errors are actually good in some ways because if you get an error, it means your code is broken and the computer kind of figured out at least at what point it stopped running, right? What's a lot of times more dangerous than these kind of failure errors are what we call silent errors, and those are in which case like your code runs, you don't get an error, so you're pretty happy. You're like, oh great, this is doing what I wanted to do, but something's failing in the background or something's not working correctly, and oftentimes you won't know it until somehow maybe someone tries to use your code or the results are actually being used and it's just way off. So don't be afraid of errors because at least that tells you that like at least gives you a really good place to start looking. Secondly is they are somewhat accurate, but once again, there's no error logging system that's like a crutch that solves everything all at once. Sometimes errors are very clear, like oh hey, like there's a syntax error, right? You forgot to close a print, you forgot to close a curly brace. That's easy to interpret. Sometimes there are reference errors, which are even better. Right? It says hey, you're trying to use a variable that hasn't been created yet. Could be a problem with your scope, could be a problem with something else. But oftentimes there's also cases in which like the error is like somewhere completely irrelevant to the code. And usually the reason why that happens is because you had bad code somewhere that triggered a silent error somewhere else, and then that silent error was used in another part of the code, and that part of the code broke. So in that case, the idea is okay, if the line that the computer says the error occurred on makes no sense to you, start there and just work your way backwards. I try to figure out who called that and then who called that and then who called that. Error messages are once again great, but like they really should supplement your understanding of your code. Like don't rely on them to just solve your code bugs for you because more often than not they probably will only get you part way. Justin?
Is code an application that has kind of like a pre-built set of things to check for that are deeper than what you can REPL, or is it mostly that some like for specific instances you've gone into test certain things knowing that you're going to write a code for specific things and a human has come in and kind of put those things in there? Does my question make sense? CodePen, does it is the application designed to like find things, or are those tests something that a human has come in and basically for a particular?
Yeah, so I think there's two things probably. Okay, so there's a difference between like a linter and like a test suite, we'll say.
Okay.
A linter, as the name indicates, it's more like kind of for polishing like basic JavaScript syntax. A linter, so one everyone who runs JavaScript, so your Chrome browser, like anyone that says they run JavaScript, it's going to have a built-in linter, right? It's going to try to run the code, and at some point, if syntactically it's not right, it will break and yell at you and say, hey, your syntax is completely off. A linter, like a better linter, goes a step further and really tries to make sure that that other areas of your code are more concise or more clear, and really you follow a lot of best practices, right? So, for example, in a linter, if your indentation is off, it will tell you and say, hey, this looks improperly indented. What did you mean, right? Or if you try to or for example, if you have a statement after a return statement, it will let you know, hey, this will never ever be called because you're doing it after the return. And so, I think in terms of kind of like having an automated system, like it can only do so much for you.
Sure.
The test suite is a more human written thing, and usually that's like more of like a oh hey, like like if I write a function that's called index of, right, and I want to make sure that that runs consistently, I write my test cases, and that could be something as simple as, I'll say, and we do follow, right, like in each of the workshops, right, we have a few lines of code that we run, and we should get certain results. That could be an implementation of a test suite, where it's like, okay, like no matter what we do to this code, these things should always be true, right? If I give you an array of 1, 2, 3 and ask for index of 2, you should give me back 1, right? And like that should always be met no matter what else that you write. So it's and testing is it's like a there's like a whole like suite of like arguments about best way to do it, coverage, etc. Probably won't go into too much of it here, but yeah, like
So the difference between REPL and CodePen is that CodePen has a finer linter with the ability to have a human program test the suite for specific things that activities that you might do.
maybe. I mean, I don't personally use CodePen that much. I think for most open source code editors, they probably all have like a very basic level of linting and trying to enforce certain best practices. However, having said that, like your code's gonna break in ways that computer can't predict. It's just gonna happen, and so like the things we're talking about now are more things that are like kind of universally like true of anything that runs JavaScript, as opposed to maybe certain tools that have like extra bells and whistles that make your life a little bit easier. Cool. All right, awesome. I mean, that's pretty much it, right? So like hopefully nothing groundbreaking, but just something we wanted to reinforce more formally and put it on pen and paper. Any questions on debugging or on arrays for that matter? Yep.
Sometimes an error can give you the line and the character that there's an error. So is this only in Babel?
No, I think most places will give you the line and character. Whether or not the line or error character is correct is like a different discussion. Like I said, right, like if it says to you the error is on line 6, it could be that the error is on line 2, right? And somehow line 2 failed, line 3 does something bad with the output of line 2, and that led to line 6 failing. So like once again, like the error of the line just tells you kind of where the last known explicit error was, but it doesn't mean that like that's for sure where the mistake happened. It could also happen somewhere else. So use that as like a starting point, but it's by no means like a guaranteed solution. But yeah, most places will give you the line character, the line number, the character number, and as far as I know, like most folks like don't really look at a character number. It's really is like the line number that kind of tells you, hey, I tried to do this and I couldn't do it, and then you work backwards from there. Anyone else have any questions?
I have a question, but it's actually more specific to a problem, so maybe I should wait. You're something generalized, right?
Cool, awesome. Yeah. If we take a break, I'll send out pairs. Get started whenever you want. We have a lot of time today for our workshop, so let's. I'll probably start the review a little bit earlier. It's only 7:30 now. I'll start the review a little bit earlier, maybe around like 8:30, 8:45, maybe 9, and then if you have time after you finish the workshops, if you can also go through the scopes colons problems. Cool, awesome.